everybody, and welcome to In Conversation, the podcast that brings you in-depth discussions with authors and thinkers whose work challenges how we see the world. My name is James Campbell, and I'm very glad to be back with you today. In this episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Shelley Sella, a physician and author of Beyond Limits, Stories of Third-Trimester Abortion Care, and Birdie Forsyth, the executive director of Chelsea's fund, which is Wyoming's abortion fund. To begin with, I should just say what a pleasure it is to have you both on the podcast. And I guess we should probably just mention how we met, which was, of course, in a fabulous independent bookshop that we were all frequenting one day last month while I was visiting the University of Wyoming. And you, of course, Shelly, were there doing a book tour. And I think Birdie was helping you out with some of that. But we happened to cross paths, and we ended up having a discussion about your work. And on this podcast, we would normally, I guess, interview many of our authors and editors affiliated with Intellect Books and Journals. We didn't publish this book. That was Beacon Press, another fantastic publisher out there. So big up and respect to Beacon. But what we try and do with the In Conversation podcast from time to time is tackle bigger topics and things that will be of interest to our listeners and to our readers. And I think this very much is a subject that's going to have a lot of resonance with different people in our broader intellect community. So thank you and welcome, Shelly and Birdie, to the podcast. How are you both doing?
Good. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, doing great. Thank you so much.
Well, let's start off with you, Birdie. A few questions. And to begin with, just wanted to ask you sort of who are you, what's your role? And can you tell us a little bit about that role that you have at Chelsea's fund there in Wyoming? And maybe just then tell us a little bit about what Chelsea's fund does and why it exists.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah. So Birdie Forsyth, I am a Wyoming resident going on 20 years here. Before that, I grew up in the state of Montana in the US. So I've always been in the Mountain West. Some folks might be familiar with Yellowstone National Park. Very close to that, if that's a landmark that you recognize. And I am the executive director of Chelsea's fund. That's the Wyoming State Abortion Fund. Primarily, our role is to remove the barrier that financial hardship might play in terms of accessing abortion care. So we do everything from reimbursing clinics for visits and procedures to providing practical support like travel funds, gas money, money to pay childcare providers, things of that nature. And a lot of the work we do is simply providing resources. Folks will often call us being pretty worried and concerned and anxious about being able to access and afford the abortion care they need. And our job is really to help put their minds at ease, let them know what their options are, and then help them meet their goal, whatever that goal is around their own abortion care story. So that's it in a nutshell.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Is it sort of like an independent charity? How does it function and operate?
Yes. So in the US, we're what's called a nonprofit organization. So we are tax exempt. And Chelsea's fund has a really fantastic origin story. It was started in the mid-90s by a woman named Chelsea in her basement in Lander, Wyoming, USA. She back then called it Women for Women. And it was really just kind of an underground word of mouth network, folks helping people out financially when they needed to access abortion care. And fast forward now to 2025, we have a list of about 10 phone volunteers that are on shift or on call at any given time, and they're answering phone calls and texts and sometimes online intake forms from people that are asking questions about, can I afford an abortion? Where do I get one? How does this work? So we're all working together to do that. And there are abortion funds in just about every state in the US, unfortunately, because abortion is still fairly difficult to access here. Even in the states where it is theoretically legal, access can be very difficult.
Yeah, I've noticed that because we have similar things here in Arizona. Even though I think that, as you say, there's different legal statuses, there's still these independent funds that are operating here, and I've been aware of that. But just for some of our listeners who maybe are outside of the United States as well, I think something that maybe people don't quite understand or quantify is the impact of maybe geography in this situation. Because, Birdie, you're saying you're from the Mountain West there. I mean, Montana, Wyoming, these are vast states. Huge land, but very few people kind of living in much of it, and like access to healthcare, you know, even to main roads and things like that is not what someone in Europe would be familiar with, right? So could you maybe tell us a little bit more about sort of the role of the funds and in the specifics in those kind of locations, like where you are, and how geography and other local issues might really play a part in why people need to come to your organization?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question. Given the example of Wyoming, we are incredibly large geographically, but we are the lowest in population out of all 50 states. We have about 500,000 people in the entire state. But land-wise, I believe we're the 10th largest. Distances between communities are very vast. I think the nearest town to the town that I live in is about 50 minutes by car. And oftentimes that road is closed during the winter. Like you can see my background here. This is our reality, usually from Halloween until Memorial Day, which is the end of May, for those that don't know. So travel can be very challenging. We utilize different services. There's a wonderful service here in the US called Elevated Access that provides air travel for folks seeking abortion care and other types of needed bodily autonomy related care. But oftentimes gas money is an issue. Transportation is absolutely an issue. And here in Wyoming, over half of our 23 counties do not even have an OB-GYN, much less an abortion provider. Currently in Wyoming, we have 2 communities where abortion is accessible. That's Casper, Wyoming, and Jackson, which is in the northwest corner of the state.
Okay. So it's not only, you know, the politics, because I think people probably are familiar with the politics and also the different politics in the United States, because it's not just necessarily at the federal level, but you've got the state level, which very much affects people's access to certain things. But it's also like the physical geography of the place is having a huge impact on people's access to abortion, but also to, you know, to different kinds of mental and physical health care providers and things of that nature too. Okay.
Absolutely. Yes, we have women traveling very long distances, not only for abortion care, but to give birth, to get just basic services. So yeah, you're right. The distance is a huge barrier to access.
And what about with funding itself? How do you go about, you know, getting the funds to help support these people?
We are donor supported primarily. Occasionally we will get a grant from an organization, a foundation, something of that nature, but we really do rely on independent individual donors who believe in this cause, who believe that abortion access is a part of comprehensive health care. And we're very grateful for those folks, many of whom started out donating to Chelsea in the late 90s and are still continuing to support us. We did get a little bit of a boost after the Dobbs decision. Folks may be aware that that's the decision that struck down Roe v. Wade, which was our federal law providing some access to abortion nationwide. So that really motivated people, I think, to start to give a little bit more to abortion funds and other related organizations.
Okay. Well, Birdie, thanks so much for giving us a bit of a background into the organization and to yourself. I just want to bring Shelly in now as well. Shelly, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you? Why are you on the podcast? And
Yeah.
of course, again.
Well, and again, thank you for inviting us. I'm Shelly Sella. I'm a retired OB-GYN. And for almost 20 years, I provided third-trimester abortion care. I provided it first in Wichita, Kansas, and people may be aware of a physician there, Dr. George Tiller, who was really one of the innovators of abortion care later in pregnancy. He was assassinated in church in 2009 because of his work. And following his assassination, one of my colleagues and I from Kansas were invited to set up a third trimester practice in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so I practiced there until I retired. And then when I retired, well, before that, I just want to kind of the genesis of where I am right now. When I always didn't, rather, I never lived in Wichita or Albuquerque, New Mexico. I always commuted from my home in California.
Wow.
And so the first plane trip that I took to Wichita, I started keeping a journal of of everything, really. And it's not that I usually keep journals, but I just thought, well, this is important. So I kept a journal, and I kept it going until the last abortion that I performed in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And although part of it was just kind of technical information, most of it was patient stories.
Mm.
And I just often thought if patients could if people could hear the stories of my patients, of the patients I cared for, they would have such a different view of abortion care later in pregnancy, because there's so much stigma attached in the US to abortion in general, but especially to later in pregnancy. So after I retired, I started writing a book, and it was published in June 2025. And you mentioned the name. It's Beyond Limits: Stories of Third Trimester Abortion Care. And that's important. The subtitle, I think, is important because I think storytelling is just so key to help people understand this issue and many other issues as well.
I sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to to ask you a little bit about that subtitle really as well, and I kind of a technical issue to start with. Sort of third trimester. Can you just explain that a little bit more, just for anyone who might not be familiar with what it means and why
absolutely.
that's sort of an important part of this debate?
Certainly. So Birdie talked about the Roe decision, which was the decision that gave people a constitutional right to abortion, which was overturned. But in the Roe decision, they divided pregnancy, as do OB-GYNs, midwives, family physicians. You divide a pregnancy into trimesters. First trimester, which is up to 12 to 14 weeks. Second trimester, 12 to 14 weeks to 24 to 26 weeks. And third trimester, 24 to 26 weeks to term. And Roe was actually kind of codified that, like, in the first trimester, it's this, in the second trimester, this is the regulation. And the third trimester, it said that a state may basically ban abortion, except to preserve the life or health of the mother. So when I started practicing, there were 2 clinics in the entire country who were providing that care. And there were 2 physicians in the entire country providing that care, and I was the third.
So in your work, you kind of talk a lot about these legal terms and definitions and things. Could you just tell us a bit more about why you feel they're kind of problematic?
Well, I think what people are still continue to talk about are gestational limits. And so people will say, and not just political parties, the Democratic Party, polls, they talk about, well, what gestational limit do you think abortion should be legal? And so it's kind of in our heads all the time, this idea of limits. And as I said, the book is called Beyond Limits, because I think we need to think beyond that, because a gestational limit is a number as opposed to a real life situation that someone is confronting. So what I'm saying is that we need to think beyond these numbers, these artificial numbers, and think, why is someone seeking an abortion? And that they know best whether this pregnancy is viable for them or not. And that ties into another word that we hear about. The Roe decision said in the third trimester, the way they defined it was a viable pregnancy could be banned by a state, except to preserve the life or health of the mother. And what did they mean by viable? They said the ability to survive with or without artificial support outside the womb. So it was a very kind of very black and white artificial decision, because how do we know whether a given pregnancy will be viable or not? But also just thinking about the time period, Roe was enacted in 1973. And at that point, the ability to survive outside the womb with or without support, artificial support, was 28 to 29 weeks. A full-term pregnancy is between 38 to 42 weeks. Today, using that definition, viable is 22 to 3 weeks. And at that gestation, over 40% of babies will die, and many will have very complicated medical conditions their whole life. So what I propose instead, and I talk about that in my book, is a different definition of viability. And viability is determined by each pregnant person. And so every time someone is pregnant, they decide for themselves, is this pregnancy viable for me or not? And how do they come to that decision? They're looking at their entire life. What will it be like for this child to come into this world? What will it be like for me, for my physical health, for my emotional health? What will be the impact of this child on my family that perhaps I can barely care for as it is? How will I be able to cover the rent and food given another family member? What kind of support do I have? Who is going to help me? The United States, I have to say, it's a cruel country. We do not have universal health care. The safety net is very limited. And so there is limited social support. Whatever there is mostly private. And even Birdie was talking about abortion funds. It depends on really the kindness of strangers. We can't expect the government to help us. And so the pregnant person decides for themselves, this is a viable pregnancy. I can handle this. This is not a viable pregnancy. It is non-viable. And to me, that makes much more sense than 22 to 23 weeks or whatever the number that someone comes up with.
And this is your kind of centering the pregnant person's perspective, basically, right? So that's kind of a big part of the book. And you also mention, I guess, like maternal indication distinguishing from fetal indication. So one would be there's an issue, and the other would be some of these external factors that you're talking about. Is that am I getting that right?
Well, I mean, I think in the book I do, and in my practice, I also made that distinction. Fetal indications are patients who are ending the pregnancy because their baby, and that is the word that they use. It's very unusual for someone to talk about their fetus.
Yeah.
But that their baby has a condition that is either lethal or will lead to very serious problems.
Yeah.
And that could be something that develops over time, so that someone, maybe in the beginning of pregnancy, everything seemed normal, but over time, the condition developed and worsened. And then maternal indications are people that we see with, or people we saw since I'm retired, but with difficult life circumstances. And I think when, at least this is in the I'm speaking specifically in the United States, but when we hear about people seeking abortions later in pregnancy, the media in general focuses on fetal indications.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the story of someone with a very desired pregnancy who found out late in pregnancy or the condition worsened and realized that they needed an abortion. They couldn't get one in their state. They had to tap into abortion funds. They had to travel. And those people, of course, are deserving of abortion care, but so are the others with difficult life circumstances, equally deserving. And in the book, so I am very deliberate about talking about their situations as well.
A scathing indication of the system, really, and sort of shocking when you think about it in the whole terms. But Birdie, let me bring you back in here as well. A couple of questions. I wanted to ask first and foremost, how did you encounter Shelly and her work, and what's your kind of connection?
Yeah, I love this question. Shelley's book is incredible. I think the first time I became aware of Dr. Sella, though, was in the documentary After Tiller. If you haven't seen that, I highly recommend. It's a fantastic piece, just illustrating the landscape immediately after Dr. Tiller's assassination. And that's the first time I encountered Dr. Sella's work. And then this book came out, and it was so incredible, I think, because of the storytelling. Storytelling has to be a huge part of what we do in terms of advocating for abortion access. And she very effectively distills real life examples, the humanity of the abortion decision. And there's this underlying feeling that we get from talking to Dr. Sella as well, of just a real holistic approach for each individual person and trusting them to know their own life. And that's enormous. And she does this in a really fantastic way through stories. We can spout statistics all day long, and you'll just see people's eyes glaze over, right? So many number of people have to travel this many miles for this amount of funding. That's all important. But if we can talk about a Catholic woman with a wanted pregnancy faced with like a fetal indication, like we were talking about, the spiritual dilemma that she has between herself and her faith, if we can bring that to light and talk about the importance of her decision that she made, and then also, you know, women experiencing domestic violence, other types of hardship that indicate pregnancy being non-viable at that time, it humanizes the issue in a way that statistics never will. So reading that book and understanding that she was really open to traveling and talking to organizations like funds, we reached out and asked, would you like to come to Wyoming? And she gave us an enthusiastic yes. And the 24 hours that we got to interact with Dr. Sella here was just magical. I'm so grateful for that time. It included a trip to the little independent bookstore. Yeah. It included about 40 folks on a weeknight sitting in folding chairs, listening to stories of third trimester abortion care, including some of our medical students from the University of Wyoming, who after the fact came up to me, said, how can we help Chelsea's fund? How do we connect with you? It was an incredibly beneficial night, and I'm so grateful that you made the trip, Dr. Sella.
Well, it was really wonderful for me too. And I think, and that was one of the purposes of writing the book. Like, I didn't just want to write it's not like I felt, oh, I need to write a book. I'm not a writer. I felt that I want to tell these stories, and then I want to be able to talk about the stories, about the book, about helping people to understand that gestational limits are harmful to pregnant people, and that it's important for us to kind of reframe how we think about abortion care. And so for me, it was really important, and it continues to be important, to go out and talk to people. And I am so thrilled. So I was delighted to have the invitation to come to Laramie, because that's really one of the, that is the most important part of writing the book, is to be able to talk about these ideas.
Well, a couple of follow-up questions. I'll come to you first, Shelley. Tell us a bit more about these stories, because it's the thing that I noticed, and it's something, obviously, as a publisher, I find storytelling to be vitally important, especially for topics like this. It's easy to demonize a statistic, but it's harder to demonize a human when you actually connect with them through a story. So Shelley, could you maybe just tell us a little bit more about the format of the book and some of the stories that you included, and just how that kind of worked out?
Yeah, so I divided the book into two parts, and part one is taking the reader through a week at the clinic, because that's another thing that people have no idea what happens. It's so stigmatized and demonized, really. And I really wanted people, in addition to understanding the people who have abortions, I wanted them to also understand the process. And so what I did was I formed 6 composite patients, and all based on patients that I cared for. And 3 were fetal indication and 3 were maternal indication. And we get to know them and know their stories as they're going through the process. And because it's third trimester abortion, it takes place over several days. So that certainly gave me an opportunity as a physician to get to know them and their families, but also for the reader to understand. So for maternal indications, and I thought that was, again, really important for people to understand that, because when people in general think about maternal indications, they think about someone with a life-threatening physical illness, but the composites were kind of exemplified who I cared for, and I think Birdie would say who she encounters in her work as well. So one is a victim of domestic violence who knew that she was pregnant, who had several children already, and knew that she needed an abortion for her and her family's survival. And she knew early on that she did, but she was trapped in her home and she couldn't escape. And there are just a lot of barriers that happened because of the abuse and the being trapped at home and trying to access money. So there was kind of this internal barriers to her getting care. And then all the restrictions, even before Roe was overturned, for people to access an abortion, waiting periods. I mean, that's just one of them, actually, and needing to sign a consent beforehand, and the money was an issue too, because only less than half of the states in the United States cover abortion care for people in need. So there's issues of delays due to her own situation, and then kind of the bigger picture of the state placing restrictions and barriers to her getting care. So that's one person. Another was someone who had a history of cancer, and that was in remission. And she started having symptoms, and she thought, oh no, my cancer has recurred. And it had. And she was also pregnant. Those symptoms were pregnancy symptoms. And I think, and that kind of typifies kind of a late diagnosis of pregnancy. Someone didn't realize they were pregnant. And we don't think about that, or we have an attitude about that. But there are very understandable reasons why someone may not realize that they're pregnant. So she's an example. And the third was, I was very deliberate in talking about a teenager. I think of teenagers as stigmatized on top of the stigmatized. Right. People have such an attitude about them. And I wanted to explain, why did this teenager seek an abortion later in pregnancy? And again, for her, there was the barriers, her family, her fear of talking to her family. She too came from a religious background, very conservative. So her fear, and then how difficult it was for her as a teenager to access an abortion. So those are an example of the three patients that I cared for. And then fetal indications, I certainly explained their situation, but I also explained one couple was very religious, Catholic, and their religion really hindered them. I mean, condemned them, didn't give them the support they needed. And another couple were evangelical Christians, and they got support from their church. So I thought it was important to talk about religion, because certainly in the United States, it's a big issue. And I think we make assumptions like, oh, someone who's religious won't have an abortion, would never have one. It's just not true. And so I was very deliberate. Again, I keep using that word, but I was very thoughtful about who I want to talk about and to bring up certain points.
Well, thank you very much for sharing those anecdotes and giving us a bit more sort of awareness of the format of the book and why you chose to include those stories. Birdie, I want to come back to you though and highlight this notion of stigma and demonization, which has come up a few times in the conversation. It's something that I and many of our listeners will be aware of. So beyond the stories and the power of this book and other people out there who are telling these kinds of stories, what other sort of tools do you have at your disposal, or what do you and your colleagues do to try and break down some of these issues around the stigmatization and demonization of abortion, especially late stage, and in conservative states such as Wyoming? How do you take on this challenge?
It's a fantastic question. Always open to ideas.
Yeah, right.
Storytelling is a huge piece of what we do. We have a laser focus right now on pieces of that. I actually just got a little bit of a grant to do some storytelling work. One of the things that we are doing is taking actual transcripts from conversations our phone volunteers have with our clients, de-identified naturally, but then putting those alongside of animations or kind of other video elements to really help tell the story of the folks that we help. I think in a red, profoundly rural state like Wyoming, there's often a misconception that abortion seekers are somehow other. Abortion seekers aren't us. Abortion seekers are people from other places, like Wyoming loves to demonize California. Sorry, Shelly.
Yeah.
I love it. It's not us, right? And the more that we can help illustrate that abortion seekers are our neighbors, our mothers, sisters, daughters, community members, your child's teacher, the more that we can illustrate that abortion is incredibly common, it's incredibly safe, and it's simply a part of a comprehensive healthcare strategy for any individual, primarily people with uteruses, right?
Yeah.
The more that we can just understand that it's part of the spectrum of being a human being that can reproduce over your lifetime. Abortion is part of that. It's not a separate thing that has some weird sort of moral, shadow over it. It's just like, I mean, you don't see the stigma for vasectomy care, for example. Just throwing that out there. So I think anytime we can normalize this, we can tell the stories, we can help folks realize that this is something that is very common, it's very normal, it's safe. I think that that's important. And there will always be a need for third trimester abortion care. Many of the reasons that Dr. Shelley Sella has mentioned here, right? There are lots and lots of reasons why need for an abortion might come up in that third trimester. And I truly believe that by normalizing it, by getting folks to see that it's part of that spectrum of care that's incredibly normal over a lifetime, that will help destigmatize it. So there may not be as much of a need for the third trimester care, because that's a process, as Dr. Sella was saying. That's a multi-day process. It's not an easy decision to make for anyone. That will continue to be the right decision for people going forward. And my hope is that by normalizing abortion care for what it is, which is super normal, folks will have better access and less stigma earlier.
Yeah, I worry that with situations that are going on politically and things like that, that it's the dehumanizing element rather than the normalizing element, and I think that's a really powerful statement you've just made there, Birdie, because things like this are normal and they, it's not dangerous, as you say, across the board, and there's a lot of subtleties and nuances, of course, but that's what you two are obviously both proponents of, is this patient-centered approach, or this pregnant person-centered approach, and dealing with those nuances with care. So go on, Shelly.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something, because I think I really like what both of you are saying. It's that the stigma contributes to the dehumanization of the patients and the providers. And that's what we're seeing also with the attacks on immigrants.
Yeah.
They're not like us. I mean, that's exactly what you said, Birdie. People who seek abortions, especially later in pregnancy, they're not like us. They're from California.
Yeah.
And it's saying, the attacks on immigrants are the same idea, right?
Yeah.
They're not us. And they've been dehumanized. And that allows the attacks to continue. And so, I mean, part of it, I agree with Birdie, is having conversations and talking about it. But then there are also the legal challenges, that Roe was overturned. And so we need these bans to be debanned. we need basically, I mean, I think our vision is seeing just exactly what Birdie said, abortion just part of healthcare, subject to any other procedure, and not be seen as a political issue.
Yeah, I think that's another really powerful point. And it leads on to my next question, and sort of tie up this podcast a bit, really, is I wanted to look ahead, and I wanted to ask you, what's your goals and sort of wishes? I know we're in a very turbulent moment politically, and there's all kinds of other external factors, the economics and things like that. And of course, going back to the top of the podcast when we were talking about the geography and the vastness of space and issues around travel within the United States and other things that other people may not be as familiar with. But like, what does the future look like? And I know this book was a long time coming, but it's obviously come out at a very powerful moment when abortion, women's rights, immigrant rights, many other groups are being maligned, dehumanized, and our constitutional rights are under attack. And of course, what started that process off, in a sense, you could say, was the overturning of Roe. So would you just maybe both tell me a little bit about what your goals are, either collectively, or as groups working in this field, and then personally, what your kind of ideas and goals are? Maybe Shelley, I'll start with you.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Roe, because I think some think, oh, we should just go back to Roe.
Right.
But that's moving backwards. And Roe was problematic from the beginning. The stories that I told you were stories that occurred before Roe was overturned. So moving backwards to restrictions is not helpful. So really what I dream of is, again, back to the title, Beyond Limits, thinking of making abortion accessible and available to everyone who needs it. And to do that, we do need to overturn the bans and the restrictions, but not thinking, oh, let's move back to a more restrictive time. And in fact, sometimes when things are the most dark and restricted, it gives us opportunities, right? Because Roe was so constraining and there were more and more restrictions being placed on it. We got rid of Roe, so now we can dream big. So Birdie, tell me your dream.
Just very quickly, I was going to say, so there is a silver lining in all of this, because what I've noticed today is and I think a lot of people maybe think about this in binary terms, especially from outside of the US, who aren't so familiar with the nuances. They'll think, oh, these crazy people came in, they overturned this amazing statute, and now there's no abortions, but it was all good before. And of course, what you're saying is it was very problematic and limited, and now it's been a constitutional sort of threat as well. But there is a silver lining in here, that we could maybe end up with better legislation, legal recourse down in the future, hopefully not too distant future. So I think that's a really important point you've made. But Birdie, please, sorry, over to you.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. To get back to what Dr. Sella said about policy and litigation, Chelsea's fund has been in litigation essentially ever since Roe was overturned. We had what was called a trigger ban that went into effect here in Wyoming, meaning that there was a law just waiting in the wings for Roe to be overturned, and it triggered a total ban. We immediately went to court. We've gotten preliminary injunctions, basically judges saying, hold tight on several of these bans and other restrictions. I would love to not have to do that, right? I would love for abortion to be considered just healthcare. And we are actually waiting on our state Supreme Court to decide that exact question. Does abortion qualify as healthcare per the Wyoming Constitution? That's a dream, right? That it's simply healthcare and you can access it like any other healthcare procedure or treatment that you need for any reason. And that's between you and your provider, full stop. I think personally, abortion funds are in kind of a unique situation where we all are kind of working towards the day that we're out of a job.
Right, yeah.
We're kind of working towards the day when the funds are no longer needed because it's accessible, because it's affordable. And honestly, I think that for that dream to really come to fruition, it's going to take a larger cultural shift that really values not only women, but values parents and parenthood. Right now in the United States, we simply don't, which is what makes a lot of pregnancies non-viable for people, because we don't have things like universal health care, child care, parental leave that's paid. There's so many of these supports that were they in place. It would just make abortion something that was not seen as this, like this desperate thing for a lot of folks, where it is now. It's not always the case at all. But I do think that until we have that comprehensive structure in place where we're really valuing women, we're valuing parents, and we're putting our time and energy and resources into supporting folks that are taking care of children, this is going to continue to be a large issue for our country.
I think that's an absolutely tremendous point and a really important one to make. And just finally, for you, Birdie, like, how can people help? How can people get involved with your fund or with maybe other funds and other organizations across the United States? I know that here in Tucson, there's various groups and they have regular fundraisers, which are really fun because it's a building together the community, artists and people getting together to create things and to raffle and to sell things and to build like community, but also education around these topics. So my own personal experience, although limited, has been really, really powerful down here in the desert. What are some of the ways that people can get involved with both Chelsea's fund and with this topic more generally?
Yeah, I think depending on where your heart lies and where you feel like your resources will be best spent, there's lots of ways to get involved. The entire ecosystem of the abortion access and reproductive justice movement, it has different little components. If you're someone that's really interested in the policy piece, the lobbying, the advocacy, talking to lawmakers, electing folks that are going to make good decisions and good recommendations around abortion care. There are lots of organizations that work towards that. If you're interested more on like the boots on the ground, practical support, direct service, the National Network of Abortion Funds is a fantastic organization. Most of the, not all, but most of the funds in the US tend to be a member of NNAF. And they are able to provide that overarching support for all of us funds who are, out in the boonies doing our work and helping people. Or if there's a state or a community that you are connected to for any reason, see if they have a fund. And I will just put a plug in also. Since this is all connected, our domestic violence shelters are another great way to infuse some highly needed dollars into the community. The example that Dr. Sella talked about in her book of the individual that was trapped in her home, knew that she needed abortion care. All of this is interlinked. So most communities do have a domestic violence shelter or some other type of organization that does need an infusion of resources regularly. So I'll just put a plug in for that also. Shelley, did I miss anything there?
I don't think so. And certainly, as I said, my goal in the book was to be able to talk about this issue. And so I'm always available to do that. So if anyone who's listening to this would like to invite me and come speak, or I'd be happy to do that as well. And that's actually how I've ended up going to different places. And I'm just really happy to do that. I think it's important for people to hear, to be in conversation so that they can start thinking about this issue in a different way.
And of course, it's how you've ended up here on this In Conversation podcast.
Exactly.
And before I let you go, though, Dr. Sella, can you just maybe, are there any final thoughts or any final things you'd like to share, or what's next for you after the book? What are you planning on doing? Is there any more promotional tours planned, anything like that?
I'm still out there talking to different people, different groups. Right now I'm focused on speaking to medical students. I think that's really important. And as I said, I'm available to continue to do that. After that, I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I guess what I'm thinking is, these are really hard times right now. It's hard to be optimistic. One source of optimism for me is meeting younger providers who are just very engaged and committed to this work. I think there was this myth of, all the providers are old and dying or dead. Who will carry it forward? There are many young doctors and providers who are carrying it forward, and that's encouraging for the future. So just a little optimism. We have to keep going.
We need a smattering here and there.
Yeah.
And for anyone who would like to support the book or buy a copy, where would you suggest them go to that?
Well, I think easiest would be to go to my website, ShellySella.com, and there's a QR code and you can order it from there. Well,
look, Dr. Sella, Birdie, it's been an absolute pleasure having you both on the In Conversation podcast today. Thank you so much for broadening my horizons and I hope really inspiring and educating some of our listeners today as well. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you both, and I'm really glad we bumped into each other in a wonderful independent bookshop in Wyoming. What was the name of that bookshop again? I forget off the top of my head. Can you remember?
It's Second Story Books in Wyoming. Yep.
I highly recommend anyone who's in in town in Laramie, you should go and check out that bookshop. It's excellent. And yeah, obviously having wonderful guests and people in there. Great meeting spot, and there's a good coffee shop across the street, that's for sure. But look, that's it for today. So thank you to you both again. And I'd just like to say thank you to all of our listeners for checking in, and we'll see you again next time on In Conversation.